When the day of the cremation arrived, I went to where the Rus had docked one of their ships. They had run the ship aground and raised 4 poles of wood to build a platform. They made sure the ship was firmly situated on the platform. Next, they take a bed and place it inside the boat. They covered it with a mattress. After that, they took the body to a pavilion on the ship and laid it on the bed. The closest male relative of the deceased is in charge of setting fire to the boat. He lit the funeral pyre that they had prepared under the ship. The attendees approached with sticks that they threw at the bonfire. Where they burned the ship, the roofs built something resembling a circular hill. In the center, they nailed a large post on which they engraved the name of the deceased and the king of the Rus. Once done, they left. Hello, this is Harold Halfdan, and welcome to Archaeological Minecraft. I'm a former archaeologist who enjoys playing Minecraft and thought it'd be fun to combine the two. In today's episode, we're going to talk about Viking Age ship burials and build 3 ships around my base on the Archaeo SMP. Ibn Fidlad wrote the words quoted in the opening in 922 AD when he was a member of an embassy sent from the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad to the king of the Volga Bulgars. He wrote that traveler's account about his experience having witnessed a ship burial by the Rus of a chieftain along the Volga River. The Rus were Scandinavians, often from Sweden and the Baltic areas, who raided and traded along the river systems of modern-day Russia and Ukraine down into the Arab world and Byzantium. They even served as an elite fighting force for the Byzantine Empire called the Varangian Guard. This first-hand account of what a Viking-era ship burial looked like paints a great picture into the key role that ships played in the funerary customs of high-status Viking-era burials. Now, when I say Viking-era, I'm referring to a time period of around 700 AD to around 1100 AD, but it varied in different geographical areas. I've seen sometimes very precise dates of the Viking era that maps it to 793 AD, or the attack of the monastery at Lindisfarne off the northeastern coast of England, to 1066 AD, or when Harald Hardrada, or Harald III of Norway, was defeated by King Harold Godwinson at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Harold Godwinson subsequently was defeated not long after in 1066 at the Battle of Hastings by William the Conqueror. But I don't like those specific dates because while maybe it works from a British perspective, that perspective ignores a lot of what was going on in the Viking era in other areas like Iceland in the west, or areas of the Rus in the east, as well as in Scandinavia itself. This tradition between ships and burials in Scandinavia, the Baltic, and northern Germanic regions goes all the way back into the Nordic Bronze Age, or around 1000 to 500 BC. It was during that period that you start seeing the use of megalithic standing stones called menhirs that were placed in the shape of a ship being used in conjunction with funerary practices. Oh, and a quick point. Sometimes you'll see a ship burial called a boat burial. I'm going to use the term ship burial in this video as boats are typically only used for rivers and ships are used in larger bodies of water like seas and oceans. These standing stone structures are often called stone ships and varied in size, some being only a few meters long, where others were over 100 meters or over 300 feet long. The dating also varies, as some date to way back in 1000 BC, as I said, and can be found from then all the way through the Viking Age to around 1000 AD. The one I'm recreating here in my base on the Archaeo SMP is based on the stone ship at Blomsholm in Sweden, which dates to around 400 to 600 AD. This stone ship is around 40 meters or 130 feet long and consists of 49 menhirs or standing stones, with the stones at the prow and the stern of the ship being 4 meters or 13 feet tall, which I find a very cool detail, like they're replicating an actual ship with stone. Stone ships are often found in fields or shorelines where they're quite visible in the landscape and from the sea. So why standing stones in the shape of a boat or ship? Well, as might be obvious, ships and the necessity to navigate and travel by sea was vital in the area around the North and Baltic Sea. Because it was instrumental to the people who inhabited that area of the world, while they were alive, the use of ships to help travel and navigate their way to and in the world of the deceased was equally vital to them. It has also been suggested that the standing stones that form the outlines of the ships might themselves be stand-ins or metaphorical representations of oarsmen. Some scholars have also suggested that there might have been a belief that through the stone ship's permanence in the landscape, that they could have acted as a liminal place connecting the world of the living and the dead, allowing a journey between worlds for the dead through the ships, in the same way that ships are used to travel and connect between the land and the sea. For the living, it might also have acted as a point for ancestral connections. In other words, a place where they could go visit where their ancestors were buried. Now, whether those scholars are right or not, I can't really say, but the connection of traveling to the afterlife through a boat seems plausible to me for a culture and society for which ships were such a critical component. However, to present a counterpoint to that opinion, some scholars have pointed out that if indeed that were so, you might think that in Norse mythic traditions and sagas that you would expect there to be mentions or stories to this effect, and there don't appear to be. Moving away from stone ships to actual wooden ships being used in burials, no doubt one of the most famous ship burials discovered is the Sutton Hoo burial. The Anglo-Saxon site of Sutton Hoo in Suffolk, England, was originally excavated in 1938 and contained an undisturbed and intact ship burial that dates to around the 6th to 7th centuries AD. Because the burial was undisturbed, archaeologists were able to find a great deal of artifacts in the burial, such as a sword, shield, a silver plate from the Byzantine Empire, and an intricate designed ceremonial helmet, of which there's a replica in the British Museum that I would highly recommend you go see if you ever get the chance. Now, there are loads of great documentaries all about the Sutton Hoo burial, and so I'm not going to spend a bunch of time talking about all the artifacts and the site, because you can just check out those great documentaries. But I'll instead focus on some of the interesting things about Sutton Hoo that I came across and stood out to me while I was doing my research. So to that end, one of the things I find fascinating about the Sutton Hoo ship burial is what wasn't in the burial, and that's a ship. That's right, since the time of the early 7th century when the ship burial occurred, nearly all of the wood from the ship degraded, and so when the ship burial was excavated, what was left behind was the outline of the ship in the dirt, and nearly all of the iron rivets that held the wooden beams together still in their original place. So what I'm doing here in Minecraft to replicate that is to not use wood to build the boat, but rather use terracotta blocks to represent the outline, rust, and different soil color. I love this detail because I think this is a great example of what can be learned through careful excavation. Archaeology is not about finding loot, gold, or treasure, as cool as that ceremonial helmet found in the excavation is. What is more important are the small details, the layer and colors of the soil, the exact placements in the ground of all the rivets, and the meticulous data collection and excavation techniques which have allowed archaeologists to reconstruct a ship which no longer exists from the evidence left around it. This ship would have been around 27 meters or 89 feet long and around 4 to 5 meters or 14 feet wide. From the keel line, the interior depth was around 1.5 meters or 5 feet deep. It was a clinker-built ship fastened, as I said, with rivets and had shown signs of being repaired, meaning it was an actual seagoing ship and used vessel prior to being buried in the grave, not one just built for the burial. I mentioned clinker-built, so what's that? With clinker-built construction, which originated in Scandinavia, the edges of the hull's planks overlap with one another. In smaller ships, those planks might be continuous, but in larger ships, there might have been several planks joined end to end. I mocked up this view in Minecraft to try and show how this was the case. So this area is the keel and runs across the bottom of the ship along the long axis. The planks which run parallel to the keel are then riveted one on top of the other, starting with the keel and going up the side of the ship, thus forming the bottom and the side of the ship's walls and hull. This created a light and flexible structure that was able to have a low draft. In other words, it could sail in shallow waters and also allow it to adjust and be flexible in the churning waves of the North Sea. So basically the best of both worlds. The ship was propelled through oarsmen or wind power via a sail on the central mast. One article I read for the research of this episode did some fascinating work around estimating the speed of the ship depending on the number of oarsmen. The Sutton Hoo ship could have held a maximum of 40 oarsmen, which would have propelled the ship at a cruising speed of 5.9 knots or 8.8 knots in a 20-minute hard burst. But in their article, they suggested that perhaps it only needed 28 oarsmen, which would have allowed for 5.2 knots cruising speed and 7.7 knot burst speed. That's around the equivalent in power to around a 10 to 15 horsepower motor. Only having 28 rowers would have allowed the central area to have perhaps contained a room for a covered A-frame chamber with a turf roof, which could have helped keep individuals sheltered, or an area for some horses to stand on a flat decking area, or for storage, or perhaps simply an area for passengers to sit and not have to row. Pretty interesting stuff, and I bring it up because I do think it can sometimes be easy to think about ancient and historic technologies in hindsight and how they could have been maximized for what we perceive as their main intent. But it's important to think about this kind of thing holistically. People had to shelter from storms. They had to transport horses and materials. And a vast majority of the time, Viking-era people would have just been going about their daily lives, trading, traveling, and whatnot. So maximizing the utmost efficiency to maximize speed or warrior count might not have been their foremost concern or priority over livability most of the time. Okay, up to this point, I've built a stone ship and the outline of a ship used in a burial at Sutton Hoo, but haven't actually built a ship. So let's correct that. But this time, I'm going to build one of these ships out in the water. I'm going to do that because if you remember, I mentioned that the ship buried at Sutton Hoo showed signs that it actually was a used ship. Well, in 2 cases, at least that I know of, ships that have been found in ship burials have been recreated in modern times and have sailed in real life. The first was the Gokstad ship, a 9th century ship uncovered in a burial mound in 1880, which was around 24 meters or 78 feet long and 5 meters or 16 feet wide. A replica of this ship was built and was actually sailed across the Atlantic from Norway to North America and displayed in Chicago in the 1893 Columbian Exposition. This replica is still on display near Chicago. Another ship found in a burial mound that has been replicated and sailed was the Oseberg ship. The Oseberg ship, which dates no earlier than 834 AD, was excavated in 1904 and 1905 and was 21.5 meters or 71 feet long and 5 meters or 16 feet wide. In that ship burial were found the remains of 2 female skeletons as well as a great deal of grave goods. One of those artifacts has been called the Buddha bucket, which was a bucket that had an ornament of a figure seated in a cross-legged lotus position. There was also the skeletal remains of 14 horses, 1 ox, and 3 dogs. Horses or horse equipment are reasonably common in ship burials, with the percentages being around 20% in Norway and Scotland, but in Iceland, 40% of graves contained horses or horse equipment. The younger of the 2 women found in the Oseberg ship burial seems to have been around 50 to 55, and the older woman was around 80. Based on the grave goods, skeletal remains of animals, and analysis of their diet, which was mainly of meat, showed the women to be very high status. Who these women were is of some debate, with some scholars pointing to them being a high status shaman and her apprentice, where in the past, others suggested it might be the remains of Queen Asa, reputed to be the grandmother of the first king of Norway, though there really isn't any confirmation or evidence to suggest that. And that's something more out of Norse semi-mythic traditions as opposed to being completely historical. I suspect attempting to associate the women with the semi-mythic, semi-historical figure of Queen Asa was more to explain why there would be a high-status woman buried in a ship burial. But women being buried in high-status graves isn't without precedent. For example, while not a ship burial, a high-status grave was found in Birka, Sweden, and excavated in 1878. That grave contained 2 horses with stirrups, a shield, a sword, and an axe, so basically the grave of a high-status warrior. Recent DNA evidence showed that this individual, assumed to be a male based on the warrior-centric grave goods, was shown to contain a female skeleton. The authors of the article that published those results suggested that as most skeletons are gendered based on their associated grave goods, it's possible as more DNA analysis is completed on skeletons, it's possible that those assumptions might need to change. Time will tell, but my point in bringing it up is that the Oseberg ship burial and the Burka high-status warrior burial show that it isn't without precedent that high-status women could be buried in high-status burials depending on their status and station in life. It's important when looking at archaeology and historical time periods to remember that different cultures viewed gender and their associated roles differently over time and place, and as such, it's important to try not to ascribe any assumptions from your own culture or beliefs onto those cultures, and instead, just look at what the data shows. Well, that wraps up this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I dropped a bunch of links to resources I used to research this episode, and would encourage you to check those out if you want to learn more. Make sure you take the time to like my videos if you like them, and subscribe and all that stuff. If you want to see more videos about subjects from the Viking Age from my channel, please check those out here. Thanks. Have a good rest of your day. Bye for now.